only lifeboat. When the planet's climate is changed, and the climate is degraded, and global warming taking place, then all the people of this planet, whether he is a citizen of the United States or of Bangladesh, whether he is a citizen of Japan or of Somalia, all are affected. Before human being came to this planet, dinosaurs ruled this planet. Dinosaurs are extinguished from this planet due to the climate change, not because of any other reason. The way we are acting, the way we are changing our very environment, what is necessary for our very survival, the prospect of humanity in this planet is becoming bleak. And before us, we don't have few thousand years, we have few hundred years to avert the situation. So we must act today, not tomorrow, to avert the situation. Otherwise, the prospect of humanity is bleak. And in doing so, the responsibility, we have the shared responsibility, but the responsibility of the polluter definitely is much more than the others. I thank you very much. With these few words, I would like to close my presentation, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Mr. Mahmood, thank you so much. And wasn't it apt that the symbol that Mr. Mahmood used to wrap up his initial words was the lifeboat? The lifeboat is our planet. We must make sure that we don't let it fill up with water. Now, we've heard about relatively positive steps that Bangladesh has taken to deal with Cyclone Sidr. Let's see the contrast with Nargis. I'm going to now ask John Holmes, please, to add his contribution.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll try to be reasonably brief. I think the starting point we need to recognize, as we discussed this morning, is that climate change is not a future problem, it's now. The main victims are people, not polar bears, and it is already a cause of death, displacement, loss of livelihood, not only the sudden onset disasters as we know them in the jargon, but also, and probably more seriously in the long run, the slower long-term effects of drought and so on. And it's not only that, I mean, disasters are obviously increasing. We can argue about the statistics and how far exactly climate change is responsible for any individual disaster or for the number of disasters in any one year. But the trend is absolutely clear that there are more disasters and they are more extreme. I mean, I'm talking about the extreme weather-related disasters. The more of them, they're more extreme, and they hit the poorest countries the hardest, and they hit the poorest groups in the poorest countries hardest of all. The point is we can't stop, at this stage at least, I mean, leaving aside the arguments about climate change and mitigation of emissions, we cannot stop these natural hazards, as we should probably call them, but we can actually make a huge difference to how far they're actual disasters. That's why we say these are natural hazards, they're not natural disasters. What makes them disasters is what we do about them, or rather what we do not do about them most of the time. So that's the key point, that the solution to these things, or at least a lot of the solution to these things, is in our hands. And I'm not going to talk much about the response to these disasters, even though that's what I spend a lot of my time on, but I want to talk about the things upstream of the response, that is disaster risk reduction and preparedness. So how do Cyclone Sidr and Nargis fit into this? I think the point about them, and I'm sure why the organisers chose this theme, is that these were very similar natural hazards. They were very, very strong cyclones. Both were accompanied, for particular reasons of the shape of the coast and the direction of the wind, by huge tidal surges, 10, 20 feet in some cases. So they were very similar hazards, but they were very different disasters. One caused the death of around 4,000 people, Cyclone Sidr in November 2007 in Bangladesh, and one killed more than 80,000 people in Myanmar. The Bangladesh history, the Minister's already touched on it. In 1970, a similar sort of disaster killed 300,000 or 400,000 people. In 1991, it was 138,000 people. In Cyclone Sidr in 2007, it was 4,000 people. So there's a huge difference. Why is that? It's not because the disasters, the hazards were different. It's because the response was different. It's because the state of preparedness was different. Bangladesh has got extremely good early warning systems of a very resilient and robust kind, making sure that the early warning reaches not only the people who listen to the weather forecasts on the radio, but reaches everybody on the beach through very simple community-based preparedness systems and early warning systems. They have shelters on stilts, concrete shelters on stilts where people can go. They have embankments. They have evacuation plans that everybody learns at school. They have the local knowledge of what you do when a cyclone hits. All that makes an enormous difference to the death toll. Of course, it doesn't necessarily affect so much the economic damage that is done. That's much harder to reduce, but nevertheless it has a huge impact on the death toll and therefore on the overall impact of the hazard and therefore on the overall nature of the disaster. Now, we shouldn't say that everything is perfect in Bangladesh either. I'm sure that the Bangladeshi representative would agree with that, and I was talking to the Bangladeshi authorities the other day about their desire to build a lot more shelters, a lot more, renew all the embankments, perfect all the systems. Nevertheless, Bangladesh has been and is a sort of poster child, if you like, for disaster risk reduction, and with very good reason. Contrast that with Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar. To be fair, Myanmar had not had the similar experience of such strong cyclones in the past, but the fact was that in Myanmar there was little or no preparedness, little or no warning of any kind, no disaster risk reduction measures had been taken, there were no evacuation procedures, there was no experience, there was nothing. And the result was what we saw, 80,000 deaths, a very, very difficult, slow response, massive damage as well, although, as I say, the damage is very hard to avoid in any case. But basically, the situation, the very different disasters were not the result of some natural process, they were the result of the degree of man-made preparedness for them. Now, the responses were very different as well. I'm not going to go into details about this, but Bangladesh is a very largely self-sufficient in these disasters because of its experience and degree of organization, but was still open to cooperation with the outside world. We were able to give a little bit of help from the UN in areas where it was needed, but also there had been a very good process of preparation for hazards like this with the United Nations, with the NGOs and others who were present, and that was helpful. Myanmar, on the other hand, obviously very suspicious about the outside world for all sorts of reasons. In terms of the response, needed a lot of persuasion to allow not so much international relief, but international relief actors into the affected area because of fear about who they might be or what they might be wanting to do. Took a lot of persuasion. Of course, it was very much with the help of ASEAN that we were able eventually to persuade the government to allow that response in, and it turned into a more normal relief operation, although with obviously some loss of time. But it's not really the differences of response I wanted to dwell on, it's the differences, as I say, of preparation and disaster risk reduction and the fundamental way in which that changed the nature of the disaster. And I think the point that illustrates is that we need to have a fundamental shift in the way we look at disasters in the face of climate change. We need to move much more towards prevention, towards disaster risk reduction, towards preparedness, with less focus on the response. Of course, there has to be a response. There has to be an international response. Countries often will be overwhelmed by the scale of a disaster, but we need to put more focus, more effort, more resources into the upstream efforts of disaster risk reduction and preparedness. And that also goes along with another fundamental shift I think we need to make, which is towards helping build national and regional capacity to deal with these disasters and not simply, again, focusing on the creation of or the maintenance of the international response. The international response capacity, again, needs to be there. We need to have the kind of international fire brigade, but it needs to be there for the exceptions and not to become the norm, which is why I think we need to spend more effort, more time and more resources on building national capacity. Overall, the aim we have to have in our sights is resilience of communities to disasters, which means, incidentally, you need social safety nets in countries as well as the disaster risk reduction measures I've been talking about. And you need to have resilience to any kind of disasters. We're living increasingly in a multi-hazard environment, so that resilience needs to be for all kinds of possibilities. Now that was all this was the theme and to some extent the outcome of the global platform on disaster risk reduction which took place in Geneva last week. What was interesting about this was that there was a real passion and commitment from the bottom up about this subject. This is not a donor-driven thing, not a Western-driven thing, not a Northern-driven thing. This is coming from communities who see the dangers to themselves, particularly from developing countries which see the dangers to themselves, see the need to do something about it, and want this to happen. There's a very, very clear message from that gathering. And the point is that there are things that can be done. You can't avoid all the damage, as I was saying, but if you have the right kind of reforestation, the right kind of water management, the right kind of measures to move people away from areas you know are going to be flooded, the right kind of measures to deal with drought in terms of water retention, drought-resistant crops, etc., you can reduce enormously the damage done by these disasters.